Everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this morning's conversation with Erika and Karen Howells. We were talking with Karen, who is joining us from the UK, about the different terms that we use for athlete development in England. So my name is Miriam Glaze. I'm the founder of Athlete Soul. We are a non-profit organization which support athletes as they transition away from sport. But we also do a lot of events and educational events and resources for athletes who are still competing, looking at all aspects of wellness and life skills. And this is what this discussion is about this morning. We are post Olympic in Tokyo. We're still in the Paralympics, but we want to start talking about what happened after the Olympics for the athletes and what they may be facing, what the Olympic blues is about, and this is why we have Karen and Erika with us here today. So the event is recorded. We will share with our registered participant. We will also share on our website the recording of the event. You can ask questions throughout the discussion this morning. You can do that in the Q&A. I will note the question and ask them to both Karen and Erika. And in the meantime, we thought we would start with an introduction from each one of them, and then we'll dive in straight into the question on the Olympic blues. So Karen, since you're joining us from so far away, and you're our guest today, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, good morning. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Karen Howells. I'm currently a senior lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Cardiff Metropolitan University in Wales. I'm also an applied sports psychologist, a practitioner. So I work with mostly individual athletes. I say individual athletes, athletes from individual sports. So swimming, triathlon, rowing, gymnastics, and so on. My research interests are in two different but related areas. The first is in an area called adversarial or post-traumatic growth. So that's when things go wrong in somebody's life, how they take the positives out of it. So really what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that kind of that mantra. And that was my first area of interest. But obviously when we're looking at adversity and the positives that can come out of it, there's the other side as well, and that's actually when things go wrong and there aren't those positives. And I found myself after the 2016 Olympics in Rio that there were lots of stories coming out in the popular media, so online, about the experiences that the athletes had had and how difficult they were finding that transition from the Olympic Games to being back home and either retiring or getting back into training again. So that kind of developed my second interest, second research interest, which is in really what we're talking about today, which is the post-Olympic blues. And my interests really at the moment are, what can we do for the athletes to mitigate against it? How can we support athletes to ensure that not necessarily they don't experience it after the games, because highs and lows are a natural part of life, but how we can support them and help them manage it. So really that's me. Thank you very much for having me this morning.
Well, thanks for joining us, and really excited to have you because you're an expert in that space. I've read, like I said before, I read a lot of your articles on the topic. It's been really informative, and I can't wait to dive in further with you this morning. So Erika, your turn. Do you want to give us a quick introduction?
Sure. Hi, my name is Erika, and I am a transition coach with Athlete Soul, but I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist. And I've worked with athletes over the last probably 20 plus years in a clinical setting, one-on-one in relationship therapy. And then that my interest in actually kind of like supporting athletes and serving them and living a full spectrum life kind of sparked from my work in relationship therapy with athletes, because I was noticing that there was kind of a gap between the services that were available, the services that the athletes wanted, and what they were actually accessing. So, and that kind of led me into getting certified as a coach. And now I am a performance coach and also, like I said, a transition coach for Athlete Soul. And I'm so thrilled to be here and learn from Karen and everything she was saying about adversity and looking for the seeds of good. It's something that I work with my clients on, and I'm so excited to hear about the research to support that because I just have anecdotal and client evidence, but I want to hear more about the research. And so I'm looking forward to being here and looking forward to serve and just normalizing some of the difficulties that can go along with the end of Olympics and even the end of any event, world championship, that kind of thing.
Thank you, Erika. And she's not saying that she was also a collegiate athlete. She was a collegiate athlete in swimming, water polo. You also now do long distance running. I was an athlete myself. I attended 2 Olympic Games, so we'll be able to share some personal experiences here as well. So let's get started straight into it. Karen, can you, as we get started on this topic of post-Olympic blues, can you tell us what the Olympic blues is?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that the Olympic blues or the post-Olympic blues is not an expression that a term that academics have come up with. This is the language that has been used by athletes, by Olympians, in that kind of anecdotal, the stories that they're telling. So as a researcher, I've not tried to create something different. I've used the athlete's language of the blues. So the blues is this term that's used in now academic, but also in media circles, to describe that negative mood that I was going to say many athletes experience after the Olympic Games, but I think I'm probably right in saying most Olympians experience, and that's irrespective of whether they have won a gold medal, got up on the podium, made a final, done a personal best, or whether they have not achieved their goals, whether they're their performance goals or their outcome goals, or even if they've been disqualified. So I think it's, or the research certainly shows that these blues, this negative mood experienced after the Olympic Games is experienced by most, if not all, Olympians, whether it's their first time Olympics or second Olympics or third Olympics. And the period after the Olympic Games is described by athletes as being really quite complicated, complex, distressing, and they have both a really negative emotional effect. So feeling lost, confused, without purpose. And there's also that kind of cognitive negative thinking. You know, what's the point? What was this all for? I sacrificed 4 years, 8 years, my childhood, my adolescence to do this. And now what? It's over. So the post-Olympic blues really encompasses all this, the negative emotion and the negative thinking that these athletes are experiencing once they've come home. And I say once they've come home, it seems to happen not immediately, but within a week or so of being at home, and then can go on for weeks or sometimes months. But really it's the negative effect, that negative mood that they experience.
And do you think that this is something, you know, we always talk about post-Olympic blues, but could there be a post-Olympic World Championship? Could they be not post-Olympic, but post-World Championship, post-World Cup in soccer? I would imagine that some of these athletes perhaps face the same thing. Is this something that is linked to your biggest event in your career, or we think it's specific to the Olympics?
I think that it can apply to post any big event, but I think it's particularly important in respect of the Olympics. If we're looking at the Olympic sports, if we're looking at sports where the pinnacle of the career is a World Cup, or for example, something like tennis, although tennis is an Olympic sport, it's more about, for example, Wimbledon. So I think it really relates to those events that are at the very top of that athlete's career. I think the Olympic Games probably is heightened, the blues is heightened for those at the Olympics, because the Olympics is such a global and well-known event. So I'm speaking from a very British perspective here, but we really buy into the Olympic experience. And as much as possible, we try and follow it on television. And certainly when our athletes win gold medals, we perhaps don't win as many as you do, but we make a really big deal of it. After 2012, for example, our post office painted our post boxes gold in the villages and towns where gold medal winning Olympians came from. So there's a public engagement with the Olympics in a way that I'm not sure there is in some of those other events. I think it happens across major events, but I think the Olympics has probably got a little bit more of the public buy-in, the public expectation. We all become armchair experts at sports we've never seen played before, and really get behind the athletes. So I think that the Olympic experience is probably heightened, but I'm saying that as an educated guess rather than any research that's been done on it, because as I say, post-Olympic blues research is very much in its infancy. It would be very interesting a little bit further down the line to see whether it actually is relevant elsewhere.
Do you think that the amount of media combined with the fact that going to an Olympic game is a lifetime goal or a decade-long goal, so combining these long preparation, reaching your goal, plus the impact of media and buzz that goes around it is what kind of heightened the impact of it afterwards?
One of the things that Matthias Lucassen and I, in our first research study looking at post-Olympic blues, found was that the media had a huge role to play. And it was about this idea of building celebrity. Mm-hmm. So again, I'll probably hand over to Erika in a minute because I'm talking very much about the British experience. But when our athletes qualify for the Olympic Games, there's a big kitting ceremony. So they go to Birmingham in the middle of England, and they get kitted out with their GB kit. And that's televised, and there are interviews with the athletes. And from the moment they've qualified, they are celebrities. And a lot of the athletes I've spoken to talk about the Olympic Village, perhaps maybe not Tokyo, but the Olympic Village being, it's like a sweetie shop. There's everything available, and anything they want, they can have. And this idea of celebrity is kind of reinforced by the media all the way home. I think one of the things that I've found most shocking in doing this research is the stories that have come from some of the British athletes coming back from Rio. British Airways, which is, as I'm sure you'll know, one of the world leading airlines, they painted one of the aircraft gold to bring back our athletes from Rio. So this was, again, a massive public spectacle. And when the aircraft landed and the athletes came out, big media storm. And from an observer's perspective, watching it, it was fantastic. We'd done so well. Our athletes coming back with more medals than they'd ever had before. When you talk to the athletes, what had happened when they got to Rio de Janeiro airport and got on board was the gold medal winners were put in first class. The bronze and silver were in business class, and everybody else was then ranked in order based on how well they did. And those athletes who were in just economy found it one of the most distressing experiences of their whole athletic career. And they had gone from being celebrity to nothing. And even those who had won medals, really achieved their goals. One of the athletes I spoke to talked about what she called the Tesco Effect. Tesco is a grocery store in the UK, a bit like Walmart, but probably a little bit smaller. And she said, I've gone from being celebrity, well-known, everything I could possibly want, and I still have to do my shopping in Tesco's and nobody recognizes me. And it's this build-up of you're amazing, you're a celebrity, and then actually you're just like everybody else.
Thanks, Karen. I was laughing at your comment on the airplane because it's so true, whatever country you're in. I remember coming back from the Sydney Olympics and it was the same with the French team. And it was the same with the Australian team. There's still a ranking when it comes to the flight back from the Olympics. Erika, have you had any athletes or client that you worked with who have experienced either the post-Olympic blues or a blues after a major competition?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the main things, and just that ranking on the airplane, I could feel that in my heart, like you work so hard for something and then having that distinction, especially if you've had like a personal record or something like that, it's just, it's heartbreaking. And, and I think it's really difficult for athletes to be able to distinguish like their identity is, especially if you're an Olympic athlete, the dominant identity is an athletic identity. And so it's by that very nature, it would be very normal for you to define yourself by how well or how poorly you do in your event or in your sport. So there's a lot of different things that could come into play in terms of emotions like confusion and anger and resentment and, abandonment and emptiness when the sport comes to an end or after the Olympic Games. And even, if you have gold medaled, I was actually reading a couple of different things because I wanted to kind of check in on what my clinical experience was to see if it was reflected in what other athletes were saying as well, because I obviously have a small sample size, smaller, but that was one of the things that was kind of reinforced in terms of what athletes were saying was like, even sometimes when you win a gold medal, it's almost like there's almost even more sense of, okay, well, what is next versus just like, if you're not performing up to the level that you wanted to, or perhaps you didn't medal or whatever the case might be. It's just an interesting effect. I think for people who maybe, like Karen was referring to, the armchair experts, I think it's easy for us to kind of look at, an athlete, okay, well, they medaled, so they're on top of the world. But that's actually not the case, especially once it's over, because you trained so long, so hard. Like Karen was saying, oftentimes these athletes are sacrificing friendships, they're sacrificing attending family events for years. And it's something that, it's difficult to be able to zoom out and see who you are as larger than your sport and not base your sense of self-worth and self-esteem on the performance in your sport. And so I think it's really important that we're giving some space to the normalization of the feelings that are associated with the end of an Olympic Games or the end of a world championship. And also, acknowledging that it's okay to be able to talk about it and to be able to, have just that normalization. I think the discussion needs to, I'm glad that we're having it now. I think that it needs to be more widely, kind of, the conversation needs to be more widely addressed so that athletes, because I think athletes are kind of trained to just not talk about stuff and push through pain and that kind of thing. And so it can be really, really disorienting to define yourself in terms of your athletic career and then not have any sort of resource, or, you know, you're supposed to just kind of figure it out afterwards and push everything else to the side and go to the next thing. And that's just, it's unrealistic. It's an unrealistic expectation.
So for both of you, how severe can the post-Olympic blues be? What have you seen from athletes, or what have you heard and spoke about with athletes? I'm thinking, Karen, in some of your articles.
This is where I'm uncertain about whether we're doing athletes a disservice referring to it as the post-Olympic blues, because blues kind of implies not quite depression. It's not quite as severe. And if we're looking at other areas that use blues, the baby blues is how you feel when you've had a child and you're just a little bit low. You know, it's not postpartum depression. It's just that kind of normal, you know, just a bit flat. And I think the post-Olympic blues, we're in danger if we adopt that as it sounds. We're in danger of doing the athletes a disservice. I think there are some athletes who come back from the Olympic Games, and I was talking to a sister of a British athlete who said that this was actually just yesterday. He's come back from Tokyo and he's a bit flat and his girlfriend's a bit worried about him and he can't get out of bed. Well, he can get out of bed, but he's just not really motivated. And I think that's fairly normal and to be expected after that big event. But for some athletes, it's depressive symptoms that if they saw a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, would probably diagnose them with depression. Now, I, as a sports psychologist in the UK, I can't diagnose depression. I can identify depressive symptoms, but I can't diagnose depression. Some of the athletes that I spoke to, if I had been able to diagnose, I would say they were certainly showing depressive symptoms and probably were depressed. One of the participants in the first study that I did a series of interviews with the same athletes, and at the six month interview, I would say that she had probably hit what I would call rock bottom. She had had suicidal thoughts. It was pretty horrific. And I know in the media, we hear all the time about those athletes who have experienced it to the extreme and have committed suicide. So I think it's a spectrum of everything from I'm feeling a bit flat today to suicidal thoughts and unfortunately following through on suicide. And whilst I don't like to say there is cause and effect, these athletes are experiencing this post-Olympics, and we have to really consider the impact that going to the Olympic Games and how those athletes are supported afterwards, the impact that can have. It may be mild, but it could be very, very severe.
Erika, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, if we're thinking about like precursors to depression or markers for kind of whatever setting you up for depression, which sounds awful, but I think it goes back to that identity piece and the lack of support. So when Karen's talking about supporting athletes when they get back from the games, I would love to see that be more readily available and have that kind of be part of the program. If you are an Olympic athlete, here's what happens afterwards, and they have there be, like a set support system. Not that everyone maybe would access it, but I definitely think that it's important because it's true. And we see it in the media with the suicides, but in the US, obviously it's been helpful to have Michael Phelps who is, you know, an Olympic swimmer, be open and talking about mental health. And I think that is raising some awareness. And obviously in the US this year with Simone Biles making the decision to not compete, to prioritize her mental and emotional health. You know, so I think the awareness is being raised, but definitely, I think some athletes can be kind of primed for some depression. And with my license, I can diagnose depression, and I have seen it. So,
Erika, do you have red flags or signs that we should be looking for or aware of in terms of looking for depression post-Olympic blues?
Yeah, I would definitely say the dominant athletic identity, which, you know, most athletes have. I mean, I even had it, and I didn't compete anywhere near the Olympic level. My collegiate career was a club sport. So, you know, dominant athletic identity, difficulty shaking off mistakes, like even when they're currently competing. I think when you see, obviously there's going to be highs and lows in life, there's going to be highs and lows in sport, but when people kind of go to that place where I'm bad or I'm not good enough, that's a shame place versus like, you know, I made a mistake. And kind of the mood being overly dependent on the outcome. I think that can be very difficult. And especially in the US culture, I think that's kind of reinforced. Not just with athletes, but with all of us. So I think that those are things to be aware of as kind of red flags. And, you know, if coaches could look out for this, I know coaches have their hands full with all of the responsibilities, but even like teammates supporting each other and just raising awareness about all of these things, I think is the first place to start. So those are some of the red flags that I've seen.
And I think it's important for family members, spouses, you know, not just your coaches, because when you return after the game, you know, often you will have a long break and you end up being around people who have not experienced what you've experienced, and they will be the one kind of looking for those signs as well. Karen, was there anything you wanted to add to those signs?
Yeah, there are so many problematic things with what Erika said there. I absolutely agree with you. I suppose in the first instance, the very fact that these athletes are at the Olympic Games, they probably have that high athletic identity anyway. So I absolutely agree that red flag is there. But as practitioners and individuals who are in a position to support, I think we've almost got to say that red flag exists just by going to the Olympics. Because those individuals haven't become Olympic athletes overnight. You know, that's something that that identity, that high athletic identity, starts to be formed in adolescence, if not before. And they've not had the opportunity to, in adolescence, to explore any other identities. So they're going into the Olympic Games with that high athletic identity. So I think that's problematic in itself for governing bodies and institutes of sport. That's very difficult. And the other thing that I kind of cringed a little bit in terms of support, because I'm a sports psychologist, and I consider that one of my roles, if not my prime role, is to support athletes. And I think in this area of post-Olympic blues, we're doing a shocking job. And the reason I say that is, again, I can only speak from the British experience, and it may be different in other countries. But when the Olympic Games is over, the coaches and the physiotherapists and the sports psychologists and the performance lifestyle advisors, they will go on holiday. They take a break because they haven't had a break in 2 years. They haven't spent time with their family. They're at risk from the blues as well. They're at risk from their mental health being adversely affected by this high and then low. So the athletes haven't got anyone to support them. And if we then turn to families, that's problematic again. I had athletes say, my parents and my sister and my brother and my partner, They've been fantastic in supporting me to get to where I am, and I couldn't have done it without them. But the families also disengage after the Olympic Games, because now it's time to invest my energy in my own job, or in my other children, or in my partner, because I've spent all my emotional energy with the significant other who is the athlete, and they're not particularly well placed to give the support. And then there's that focus on outcomes. Again, in the UK, we are funded in different sports based on the number of gold medals. So that even with psychologists like myself saying, you know, let's stop thinking about the outcome, let's think about the performance and the process, and consider the athlete as a human first rather than an athlete first. At the end of the day, it comes down to money, and it comes down to winning medals. And if you win medals, you get funded. So all those red flags, we kind of create them.
Mm-hmm.
And the athletes are, we're kind of throwing these red flags at them.
Yeah.
Sorry, that analogy didn't work particularly well, but I agreed with everything you said there, Erika. I just think it applies to the majority, and I don't know how. It's just.
I think one thing that you ladies too have not mentioned, and I think plays a very important role in this situation after a big competition or after the Olympics, is the fact that these athletes are completely exhausted, physically, mentally. They've invested so much time and effort up to that point. Mm-hmm. They've had these incredibly highs at the games, whether it's from the adrenaline of the competition, the endorphin of the amount of exercise that they've had done for that period of time, and then everything deflates after the Olympics. So I imagine that combined with the fact that you have achieved, you know, your biggest goal in your life, or you have medal, or maybe you didn't and you're really disappointed, the combination of the physiological and the psychological must be also increasing this whole situation.
Right? Absolutely.
Do you have suggestions on what can athletes do to better prepare? So we said the first thing is, you know, let's talk about it, let's normalize it, raise awareness. I think athletes are quite aware now that post-Olympic is hard. Is there anything specific that they could be doing to help themselves as they go through that period of time? Erika, any suggestions?
Yeah, so I can talk about this for days. I have stuff that I would love to see families do, and then what the athlete can do. So one of that I think in an athlete, you know, and again, if we're starting this young, like Karen said, Olympians aren't born overnight. So like even post-adolescence or pre-adolescence, starting to experiment with the idea that you're more than your sport. And also with that, really starting to get curious about what is it about this sport that gives me joy. So not necessarily the sport itself, although, you know, it might be actually like whatever, being in the water and throwing the ball at the goal or whatever it is. But it's like, what is it about the sport? Is it the competition? Is it the teamwork? Is it knowing that, you know, each day you're pushing yourself to a different physical limit? What is it? What is it about that, in that activity that you love? You know, it could be that feeling, the sense of mastery, like knowing that this comes easier to me than other people, but just starting to kind of zoom out a little bit and see this, like, what is it about the sport? What is it about what I'm excelling at that really gives me joy? Because I think that's a different question. You know, when you're looking at perhaps the feelings that you generate as a result of what it is that you're doing, or that sense of belonging with a team or working towards a common goal. I mean, that was a theme that I've seen in each and every one of the athletes that I've worked with. And then also I was just kind of anecdotally looking around and reading things, but like two of arguably the best quarterbacks in the US, Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers, they both talked about wanting to feel like they're contributing to something larger. And I know Drew Brees talks about that too. And that was the whole reason why he went to New Orleans. So I know we're talking about Olympics, but the whole idea of wanting to contribute to something larger than yourself, I think is a really big piece. And that can start pretty early. And so getting curious about that and just starting to kind of, you know, not necessarily say, oh, I got to direct my energy away from the sport, but just getting curious about what is it about this that really lights you up? What is it about this that really gives you joy? Because that can give you ideas for other things beyond like your sport. Not that you need to go there immediately, but I think that that's a really good jumping off point in terms of preparation, is to just get really curious about what is it about this that you really love, and look at that and kind of what that brings out in you.
I like this, Erika, because it's all about what we can do before and the preparation throughout your life. What are you beyond athletics? Karen, do you want to add to this?
I just wanted to tell a little anecdotal story on that point. One of my co-researchers on the most recent research we've done on this is a 3-time Olympian and has just won her first medal in Tokyo. And she started off by being one of my participants in my first post-Olympic blues study. So I've kind of retained a relationship with her over the last few years. And she did just that through her athletic career. She loves what she does and she's absolutely passionate about it. But she went into Tokyo, I suppose maybe 3 years back. The media started talking about her as being one of our great medal hopes. And she was talking to me about 4 or 5 weeks before the Olympic Games and was saying, they are putting, the media are putting so much pressure on me to say, I want to win. And she said, I will not say it. She said, I am saying, and I'm making my message very clear, I'm going out there to enjoy it. I love my sport. And her message was very much, I want to be an inspiration to the young athletes coming through, that sport is something to be enjoyed, to do well at, but it's not about the winning. But even as a very seasoned Olympian, she was under so much pressure to say the statement, I want to win gold. So that there is the what we know to be, I think, the way ahead, which is about that intrinsic motivation, that joy that you talked about, Erika, and getting young people to explore different sports, multiple sports, different activities, and yes, to pursue things they enjoy and to do well at them, because that's good for self-esteem, but it's not all about the winning. But I think our societies, and I say that, I think Western society, Eastern, it doesn't really matter. It is about some kind of winning and showing ourselves to be the best, and to counter that, I think, is very, very difficult. And yeah, the narrative here is very much about we want our athletes to win, we want them to come back with medals, and the athletes find that very hard to counter. I think we do the right things. We've started to do that, what you suggest, Erika, with our young talent development athletes. You know, that's about what do you enjoy and the pleasure. But as soon as they get funding, you know, that it becomes a completely different story.
Yes, I have seen after the Tokyo Olympics, some athlete posting on social media about their celebration, reviewing their event with their families, you know, doing some sort of party with friends, showing their medal, looking at their pictures and previous performances. And I think this has been done because so many families haven't been able to travel to Tokyo, so that has made it a little bit different from previous Olympics. However, I actually think that this could be a good way perhaps to process. And I was curious of what you both think in terms of what can be done immediately after your performance in order to kind of balance the effect of the Olympic blues, debriefing with your coach, celebrating what you have achieved and learned, taking time to rest, taking time to reevaluate your goals, maybe if you're going to continue the sport. Are these things we can do right after the games?
Can I take a step back a little bit? And because Erika talked very much about early on in an athlete's career, kind of thinking about the joy. I think the next step, I think that's right, but I think the next step is when we're looking at athletes going to the Olympic Games, there is a really important step there, and that is preparing those athletes for what might come afterwards. Mm-hmm. So athletes who've already been to the Olympic Games know what's coming, and that hopefully they're able to reflect on what worked last time, what didn't work last time. Now, how am I going to manage how I feel afterwards in a slightly more constructive way? But for the first time Olympic athlete who's qualified, they've achieved probably the first step of their life goal. They're not thinking about afterwards. And I think that's a step that is fundamental in addressing this. So before we get to what can they do afterwards, whether this is just one psychoeducation workshop or whether it's a focus group with other Olympians, sorry, I say other Olympians, athletes who've been to the Olympics before, just saying, it is normal to feel this afterwards, and you are going to come down from this high, and that's okay. You are going to feel low, you are going to feel upset. Here's the support available if and when that happens. But I think so many athletes go into the Olympic Games for the first time and they are absolutely, totally ignorant of the fact that they're going to feel like this afterwards. So I think before we start thinking about what we can do afterwards, building on what Erika says about, which is for me about a culture of sport that ideally we should be fostering, there is, in the same way that we prepare our Olympic athletes for how to talk to the media, we should also be preparing our Olympic athletes for how are you going to manage when you get home and your partner's gone back out to work, your coach is on holiday or fired, your sports psychologist is also taking a break because he's been out in following you around for the last 6 months. What are you going to do then? So I know that I didn't answer your question then, but I think that there is that fundamental step that we've got to implement before we start thinking about, well, what can athletes do when they get back? They have to be prepared for, I'm going to have to do something when I get back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you're so right with the first-time Olympian. I went to 4 Olympics, 2 as an athlete. The first one is completely different than any other Olympics afterwards. Once you're prepared, you know what to expect, you know the size of what to expect, and the media and everything that's pulling at you from all directions. But the very first time is completely different. And I think you're right, being prepared, being taught what it's going to look like, and then what it's going to look like afterwards, I think is really important.
The current research that we're doing, hopefully is coming out for publication soon. We interviewed, we had focus groups with, I think, 24, 26 Olympians. And what they were adamant about was that preparation should come not from sports psychologists, not from sports science teams, but from other athletes. So Olympians who've been through it before. And it didn't matter whether we were talking to Olympic gold medalists or athletes who've been disqualified or those who met their goals it doesn't matter, across the board, their narrative was consistent. We need athletes going into the Olympic Games to know what's coming out the other side, and we need to hear it from people who have been through it. And to paraphrase one of the athletes, because I'm a little bit conservative in how I say things, what he said is, I don't want to speak to a sports psychologist because they've never had their balls against the wall. They don't know what it's like. Mm-hmm. They want to hear it from other Olympians who've been through it. And I think building that community of support, which involves Olympians, not saying not involving sports psychologists, performance directors, coaches, and so on, but that is includes Olympians who tell their stories, I think would be the biggest change we could make to improve the experience, particularly of first-time Olympians.
That's really interesting. What about an athlete who has not had a good performance or reached their goal from a performance point of view? Do you have a recommendation on how they can be dealing with this after the Olympics? Erika, is this something you want to comment on?
Yeah, well, I love what Karen said, and that, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could start a community of athletes to serve other athletes? When we're talking about working to serve the larger, I mean, that would be just it. So I just love that. But with regard to kind of an unsatisfactory or feeling like they had an unsatisfactory performance, I mean, I think that's, you got to allow some space for the feelings with that. And I know that that can be easier said than done. But I think it's important to not only, because you can obviously feel the gamut of disappointment, or, perhaps you feel like you weren't able to perform at the potential, at your true potential, which I think is the most frustrating for athletes, when they feel like, I know I had more in me, but I just couldn't get there, versus knowing that they left it all out in the field, or whatever the case might be. Just acknowledging the feeling and allowing for the whole gamut, because you can't bury feelings. So it's important to have some space to allow everything that comes up around that, in terms of a feeling experience. And then at the same time, experiment with looking for the seeds of good, looking for what you can learn. And it's difficult, if you know that that's your last, that was your last shot and you're not going back, you're going to need to give yourself some more space for that feeling, the feelings to kind of, you want to have the grief and the loss experience. And I always like to kind of liken grief and loss to like waves in the ocean. Sometimes they're going to smash and push you right over, and then sometimes it will be okay. But just being allowing whatever the whole gamut of the feeling experience, which I think as an athlete can be very, very difficult. And then if you're noticing, if you're kind of stuck there and you're continuing to rehearse it, like if it's 6 months out, or, you're noticing that this is really taking over and you're not able to enjoy things the way you did. I mean, kind of reflecting back to what we had talked about at the top of our time together with depression, I think it's important to make sure that there are, people that you can actually seek help from, who are qualified and experienced, whether that be another Olympic athlete or, a therapist. But I think it's also important to be really, like the relatives, the parents, the friends, you want to make sure that you're being really mindful if that's something that you're seeing your athlete go through. To be as compassionate and listening, not putting your 2 cents in. So it's kind of a multifaceted thing to be able to create space for an athlete to process feelings, even in their own. Athletes have to be able to start to practice with creating space in their own emotional environment for feelings and things like that. So I think that that can be a challenge. But I know that if it's something you just try to push through and bury, that at some point it's going to get your attention.
Yeah, and sorry, Karen, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that the word that Erika used early on, and we've used a couple of times about normalizing, that actually if you, I know this is a harsh word, but if you fail to reach your goals, if you fail to meet your own expectations, then it is normal to be angry. It is normal to be upset. And to normalize that, and to say it's okay to mourn what you have lost. It is okay to be sad, to be upset, to be angry, to be frustrated. And as practitioners, we've got to be very careful we don't kind of medicalize what's normal human emotion. That, you know, I don't think there's ever going to be a culture of going to the Olympics where somebody comes back and says, well, I did my best, and I'm happy. Yes, we'd like our 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 15-year-olds, masters athletes in sport to say, yeah, at the end of the day, I just did my best. I had some fun. That's great. But the reality is that's not how Olympians go into the Olympic Games. They go in to perform at the highest level. And when they fail, acknowledging that it's okay to be angry, it's okay to be upset, and almost riding that wave of that loss. But we've got to be really careful that we don't try and cure it or stop it or prevent it. That these blues are unpleasant, they're nasty, they potentially resemble depression, but loss and grief is normal. And it's about supporting them through this rather than trying to stop it from happening.
Yes, and all these emotions, whether it's because you fail at achieving your goal or you have achieved your life goal of going to the Olympics, this is going to bring a lot of emotion as just a closing, whether you close it or not on a high note or if you close it on a good note. At what point should an athlete perhaps consider seeking further help if they're feeling stuck in the processing of those emotions, or not processing? Sometimes they won't realize they're not processing it. Sometimes they will feel stuck. Karen, do you have any recommendations?
I think that I've got a couple of answers to that. I think the first thing, almost going back to what you were talking about with red flags, for me, a red flag of an athlete who is not coping is that initially they look like they're coping very well. So they've gone into some kind of denial, and because they're in denial, they're not getting the support that maybe they need. And potentially they're experiencing just this, I've had athletes talk about this negative tape going round and round in their head, and they just can't, they're going through this spiral. When potentially they're dreaming about the event, they're dreaming about the loss, they're dreaming about the unpleasantness, the thoughts are very intrusive. When all of this has an impact over time on their functioning, then it's time, I say it's time for them to get help, but when they're ready. Now that could be 4 or 5 weeks after the Olympic Games, it could be 6 months. But for me, a red flag is really somebody who is coping far too well, because that suggests to me denial. And unfortunately, when somebody's in that denial, the support seems to just dissipate, it disappears. And again, I've seen that, not so much in post-Olympic blues research, but in adversarial growth, where coaches say, I didn't offer any more support because I thought she was doing so well. I just didn't see the signs. She was getting on, she was performing, she was back at training, she was doing really well, and I just didn't realize that she was still in a very bad place.
Yeah, Karen, this is a really good side transition actually, because I was going to ask if for an athlete who continues on in their sporting career after the Olympics and decides to go on for another cycle, another quad, should the coach kind of decide to go on to, okay, let's reset, see what you're going next, what are the goals? Do we need to have some sort of like just complete reset, looking for what's the motivation for the next set? And I was one of these athletes who went from the Olympics and went straight into the next thing and straight into training and took very little time off, and it impacted the next season. And I think that's pretty common.
In the UK,
yeah.
Most of our athletes are encouraged to take time out after the Olympic Games. So whether that's 4 weeks or 2 months off, it's fairly normal in most of the main Olympic sports. Obviously not in sports like tennis, for example, where the Olympics isn't the pinnacle of their sport, but most athletes try and take some time off afterwards. I think the issue that a lot of the athletes that I've spoken to have with that is that they're taking that on their own, that there's no support during that period. But I do think that there needs to be a reset. There needs to be an evaluation of what's happened, and then a reevaluation of goals, and almost starting, right, we're starting here, new set of goals and so on. I'm going to say, but for that to happen after a period of the athlete being on their own, I think that needs to be managed very, very carefully. And I don't at this point have the answer to that and how that happens. But going straight from the Olympic Games to a period of time off with no support and then back into, right, where are we going, kind of is missing an important step about actually how do you feel? How have you managed the last couple of weeks on your own? Where do we go from here in the short term, rather than thinking for the next 4 years?
Erika, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I think that I would say exactly what Karen was saying. I think it's difficult sometimes for athletes to give themselves that time off, even if it's just, I'm going to give myself a break for, 2 weeks, not thinking about what I'm going to prepare for next, especially if you're in a cadence of that. So, yeah, like ideally having some structure right after the Olympic Games would be so helpful for them, and even if it's other athletes who've been through it, like Karen was saying. I
think that's a good point, Erika, because I think it's true that most Olympians get a big break after the Olympics, probably the biggest break they've ever had in their entire career, the longest one for most sports, something they're not used to. I mean, if you take like swimming or gymnastics, they'll have a big break, and those are sports where you never take that much time off. So not only they have to sit with themselves for such a long period of time, something they haven't experienced, but they'll see so many changes in their body for that period of time that will impact them from a psychological point of view. So I like the idea of starting back with a check-in, a reset, and figuring out how you refuel your motivation, I think is also really important. If there needs to be a debriefing of their Olympic performance, when do you think that needs to happen? Could it be something that happens straight away? Does it happen when you come back? Any suggestion here, and could that help in any way?
I've had mixed responses from athletes on that question, and I haven't found any coherence. Some want an immediate evaluation of what they've done, a reflection, and really not even to leave the Olympic Games until that has been done. Others want to step away, reflect, and come back and look at it a few weeks later. I think that probably comes down to the individual athlete and their individual needs, and the relationship that they have with the support staff and their coaches and so on. But yeah, I haven't found any consistency in responses. I think the only consistency in relation to that is that all the athletes wanted somebody to be there at the end of their performance. And unfortunately, you heard stories in the most recent research that we've done that they got to the end of their race and the coaches had gone. They didn't even stay to talk to them at the end. I don't know whether that was coaches leaving in anger or whether there was something else going on, but I think it's down to the individual athlete in that case.
Yeah, I was going to say the exact same thing. Like, there's no one size fits all, I would say, for that. The process is different for everybody.
And I think for the whole processing, like we know, sorry, every individual is different. Every athlete is different. They will want to process, they brief their performance differently. They would want to process their emotions and feeling differently. Someone might need more time off than someone else. It also depends on their experience, their age, where they're at in their life and their personal situation as well. So it's really individualized. So we've reached our time for this morning, but I wanted to highlight a few points that you have shared throughout the discussion, and maybe there's something else you want to share in closing as well. But what I hear is, we want to make sure we help athletes develop outside of sport, know why they're doing their sport, why they're liking their sport, but understanding that it's not everything. That's for their career in general. So looking at the culture of sport, and then have them more prepared, especially if they're first-time Olympian. They need to be aware of what happened after the game, what that time can look like. Hearing that from other Olympian has more impact for them. And then taking time off, taking time to process, whatever that looks like for you, considering that your situation is individual. It might be different than someone else, and you want to take time to process, to celebrate, to reset, to recover. Does that summarize kind of what we talked about this morning, and understanding that every Olympian is also at risk just by the intrinsic fact that they are Olympians? Anything else you want to add?
I think that was a very good summary.
Erika?
Yeah, no, I agree. That was a great summary.
You're well. Thank you to both of you. Thanks for everybody who has joined us this morning. I really appreciate, Karen, that you took the time from England to share your expertise. We can't wait to see and read your publication on the topic, if you can share that with us. And yeah, thank you to both of you. I will be sharing the recording with everybody, and I wish you all a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a
Thanks,
pleasure.
ladies. Thank you. Bye-bye.